check my audio devices. What? Okay. Test. Okay. We are working. All right. Hello. Only 2 people so far, but hopefully more people show up. If not, that's fine. What a rainy day we have today. I actually don't mind the rain, but according to the Weather Network, the ground is already saturated. So I don't know if this means like a risk of flooding for low-lying areas, but hopefully not. Maybe your reward may be that it might not be that long of a lecture. Or maybe our reward will be lots of interesting discussion. I'm not sure. I certainly have a set of slides that are on the shorter side, and well, I'll probably announce this again at the end of the class in case more people show up. But I think that for our last lecture, which is next Tuesday, I will just cover ecofeminism, because here we go. Yeah, I think next time I will just cover the section on ecofeminism, because that will allow us to kind of reconnect some of what we're talking about in this chapter with what we've talked about from the previous chapter we covered, which was women, feminism, and technology, of course. And then the remainder of that final class, we can kind of discuss and reflect on what we've learned. So we'll just go to the end of the slides today, which are not that long. Have what discussion we can. And yeah, I might, if we end early, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Incidentally, my partner is a little under the weather today, so I might have to spring into action, make some chicken soup or something, right? So today will be fairly light, I suppose. There must be some kind of relationship between the length of time we've been carrying on in the term and how what's the word? How fatigued we all must be. The further we go, the longer it seems, the more tired it seems, especially with COVID and everything that's going on in the world. So anywho, let's share my screen and we'll jump right in. All right. Oh, here's Jonah. Okay, from the beginning, there we go. So continuing on, discussing the anti-technology movement. Last time, of course, we talked about Romanticism as a sort of springboard for the anti-technology movement. The Romantics, as we learned, embraced the passions and direct experience. They did not outright reject science and technology, not by a long shot, but they thought that we were kind of going about it the wrong way, right? And the sort of pre-Romantic thinker, the thinker who anticipates the Romantic movement the most, whom Duzic discusses, was of course Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought that civilization sort of corrupted us, right? Before civilization, at least before the ancient peoples became too advanced, they were, you know, they lived in harmony with nature, as opposed to, you know, the decadence that Rousseau would have seen in his own life. I mean, Rousseau is kind of sitting around that whole tumultuous period surrounding the up before and up to the French Revolution, or just after, rather. Or just before. Actually, I can't remember the dates he was alive. So sorry, I'm blanking on that. But if somebody has the old slides open, they can tell us. Anyway, and it's from Rousseau that we have kind of got that idea of the quote unquote noble savage, which, you know, not the preferred nomenclature. Don't say that to people. But his idea was that the sort of early human society, the sort of hunter-gatherer society, which he totally highly idealized. I mean, hunter-gatherer societies do tend to be more egalitarian and have more leisure time. However, it's not like life is super easy. Hunting and gathering societies. In one documentary film that I watched about a community in Africa that still hunts and gathers, I remember they followed these two hunters, and there was a European kind of like camera crew following them, struggling to keep up, obviously. They're not used to these long sort of treks through the savannah. And it was like a whole day of hunting and gathering, and all they found was a beehive. And they got the honey and the honeycomb and brought it back. And it was, you know, what a treat. I mean, nice honey is great. Nature's candy, right? But a whole day just to get maybe this much, like a beehive that you could hold in your hand and take it back to your family. And to get the bees, you're getting stung, right? So, you know, not easy. A lot of other thinkers latched onto Romanticism because of the pollution, the dirty streets, right? This is Industrial Revolution time. So poets, musicians. I mentioned Beethoven as an example of a romantic composer that I'm really into. Other philosophers, I think Nietzsche arguably was a name that came up, and I think Nietzsche's often classified as a sort of pre-existentialist, but I think he fits within that romantic category very comfortably, because Nietzsche, you know, while not rejecting science, points out that science has made it impossible to live the way we used to live. That's what the whole "God is dead" quote is about. God is dead and we have killed him. So he's not anti-science. It's just that science has shown us a way of understanding the world that means we can't believe in the things we used to believe in. So what do we need to do? We need to do things like, you know, embrace untruth, embrace our emotions, embrace your fate. Yeah. Beyond Good and Evil, I suppose, is and maybe Gay Science, very romantic works from Nietzsche, so you can check those out. And then we moved on to Luddism. Luddism started out as you know, a group of individuals who were sort of rebelling against technology. They were anti-technology, smashing machines, because they were home workers whose livelihood was threatened by automation. There's a story about the word sabotage, you know, to sabotage, to break a machine, that probably isn't true. This is one of those apocryphal stories, but it still says something interesting about the time. Around the same time, people would wear wooden safety shoes in factories called sabots. And the story goes that anti-technology workers would fling these wooden shoes into the machinery in factories to jam up the gears and stop the machine. And the story goes that that's where the word sabotage came from. It may not be true. We don't really know. I personally think of it as probably not true. It's probably just it's a folk tale. So even if this is not literally where the word came from, it does say something important about a group of people living in a certain time and place and what their outlook would be toward technology. Neo-Luddites, as we talked about, are really more concerned with what Duzek calls lifestyle issues. How do we live with technology? Do you want to be on your phone all the time? Do you want to live in the metaverse? A Neo-Luddite would say no. You probably don't, but they are not necessarily anti-technology, although some are, like the Unabomber, Ted Krasinski. So with that recap out of the way, let's begin to look at ecology. So we have this section, ecology, the conservation movement, and the political ecology movement, all tightly interwoven. Of course, ecology is a branch of biology, which originally dealt with organisms in their natural communities. And I suppose it still does, but the way it does it has sort of changed over the years. Ecology, the word, was coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1966. Haeckel was a German evolutionist, pre-Darwin. Remember I said last time that there were evolutionary thinkers before Darwin and during Darwin's life. Haeckel was one, Lamarck was another, whoops. But it was Darwin, along with Alfred Russel Wallace, who sort of co-discovered how it works, gave us a mechanism for it, which was natural selection. So Haeckel coins this term, and they're all about, just looking at the time when it first got going. Ecology is interested in organisms in their natural communities. Probably not all that different from thousands of years ago when Aristotle was hanging out by the lagoon, except without all the teleology, right? A lot of observation, a lot of cataloging, and a lot of trying to see how the system that is the ecosystem works. In the Americas, a thinker called Frederick Clemens, among others, started to develop ecology into the study of sort of successions of plants and animals in particular areas that change over time. For example, ecosystems evolve, not just animals, but ecosystems themselves. An ecosystem might start out as a pond, but because of geographic changes or geological changes that occur over time, the pond may eventually turn into a marsh, and the marsh, given enough time, may dry up completely and grow into a forest. Or it could happen the other way around, right? But the point is that there's a succession of plants and animals in a particular area. So in the pond, maybe we have lots of fish and some frogs and birds and beavers and those sorts of creatures. But once it turns into a marsh, it starts to change. Yeah, we still have birds and fish, but maybe the beavers are getting out of there because, well, the water's not deep enough for them. And then finally, when the marsh is completely dry, we have a forest. Lots more birds, no fish or beavers at all, except maybe when the beavers emerge to harvest a tree, for example, right? So this idea of succession here is interesting. Way back in Aristotle's day, Aristotle didn't really found ecology, but he was the first zoologist. And yeah, he spent 10 years on this, hanging out by a nice, beautiful lagoon, looking at the creatures, taking samples, really into vivisection, which is kind of gross. Vivisection is when you dissect a creature while it's still alive. Aristotle was into doing that to learn about how bodies were organized. But Aristotle didn't really look at the system as a whole beyond his simple teleology, right? Every creature had a purpose or an end or a telos. The purpose of the fly is to feed the frog, and the frog is there to feed the bird, and the tree is there to provide shade for the animals, so on and so forth. And also with Aristotelian science, there's no experimentation. There's only observation and thinking about it. So in the 19th century, that sort of teleology had been dropped from the sciences. That was gone out of the sciences fairly early, actually. Aristotelian metaphysics were dispelled around the time the scientific revolution really got going. A lot of those early thinkers, Copernicus, Descartes, Galileo, rejected Aristotle's theory of causality in favor of a more mechanistic type of causality, like billiard balls, billiard ball causality, like David Hume and his billiard ball examples he's always using. Another idea here, which echoes that teleology, though, is maybe this idea of a climax community, a sort of community where all the plants and animals are in a harmonious equilibrium. The idea is that there's a rigid succession from different kinds of different environments. Their ecology changes until it reaches an equilibrium. And here I think is where, ecology is, now it's starting to sound like the ecology that we know, right? This equilibrium sort of harmony, balance, everything's balanced just right. And we humans are coming along and messing it up with our carbon emissions and our deforestation and our pollution of the oceans and whatnot, right? Duzic writes further here, Clements borrowed this approach. This is Clements who talks about succession in climax communities. Clements borrowed this approach from pre-Darwinian evolutionist philosopher, sociologist, and later social Darwinist Herbert Spencer. Both Spencer, with his organismic theory of both natural communities and human societies, and Haeckel, with an overall organismic view of human societies, shows the strong tie of early ecology with holism. Now, remember, we didn't look at that box on holism last time, box 11.1, but you can take a look if you like. But the key takeaway for holism for our purposes is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? That also means that the whole determines the functioning of the parts. So if you think of some ecosystem, you can kind of cash this out a little bit. Let's do that now. Let's think of an ecosystem and try and specify why that ecosystem is greater than the sum of its parts, and how the whole can actually determine how its parts work. What kind of ecosystem would be good to talk about? How about the rainforest? Something like the rainforest. So many species in the rainforest fill roles that they've adapted to fill, which are also beneficial for the forest, right? What's happening in the chat here? Yeah, that was another thing. I was thinking maybe of coral reefs. Yeah. Ecosystems that are kind of in equilibrium. And each creature there and each plant there seems to fill a role that's determined by everything else, the whole system. And we can see the idea of balance there, right? It's almost like the whole thing is a life form, right? And we are going to talk about this. This would be a super organism, and we are going to talk about those in a moment. But yeah. And holism, really, this is curious that they're both applying this to human societies, because holism is also how the ancients sort of thought of their own societies. I kind of often think to myself that the ancient Athenians might have thought of Athens, for example, a bit like a beehive, right? A community. The Greeks were, of course, much more communitarian than we are now. We are much more individualistic, in the West. But the ancient Greeks were much more communitarian. The city-state, or the polis, was like a parent almost. You get this when you read the Apology of Socrates anyway, the way he talks about Athens before he's condemned to die. So interesting stuff about holism. But yeah, so if you've got a rainforest or a coral reef, the little niches that all the little species that live there fill do seem to serve a function. It's not a teleological function. It's just it's just what they've adapted to do, the roles they've adapted to fulfill. But those roles go toward supporting the equilibrium of the whole system, and the whole system can also determine the roles that it's possible for creatures to fill. So only certain kinds of food grow, so certain kinds of birds live there and they eat the fruit and poop out the seeds somewhere else, and new trees grow, and it's all very delicate balance. So that's Clements's approach: climax communities and harmonious equilibrium. But there's a darker side to the influence of some of these thinkers, especially Spencer and Haeckel. Duzic writes, there is a darker side to Spencer and Haeckel's influence, with the ideology of social Darwinism and imperialism common among many of the followers of Spencer, and with Haeckel's monosociety, which according to some devolved into the Nazi movement after Haeckel's demise. So social Darwinism is Darwinian natural selection applied to humans, artificial selection, really, the eugenics movement. I don't know about Haeckel's monosociety, and I don't know this Gassman who claims that it devolved into the Nazi movement. Let's get back to that in a moment. But social Darwinism was everywhere around the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Eugenics was a hot topic in the late 19th and early 20th century. Eugenics just means well born. The idea was to selectively make people better through a sort of selective breeding, and eventually through forced sterilization, and then eventually through euthanasia, and then finally it culminated in the Holocaust, with the death camps of the Nazis. So, and it's not like, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, but everyone's like, oh, the Nazis, totally evil, the Holocaust. Yeah, absolutely, totally evil. But it's not like they came up with the idea of eugenics, right? Everyone was doing this. A lot of people were, we weren't sending people to death camps in Canada, but we were sterilizing people. We were sterilizing First Nations, members of First Nations communities. We were sterilizing people with physical and mental disabilities. We were sterilizing homosexuals, right? This is not particular to early 20th century Germany. This was all over the place. Canada, England, the United States, pretty messed up stuff, considering that we did not even know the structure of DNA. All of this was prior to the discovery of the DNA molecule, what it looked like, and how it worked, which gave us an actual mechanism to explain genetics. It's pretty crazy stuff, if you ask me. Did Haeckel's monosociety devolve into the Nazi Party? No, I don't think so. The origins of the Nazi Party are super weird. It almost sounds like fiction, but there was a sort of occult society called the Tula Society. Not Tula like my dog. Hi, Toots. Spelled like this. I'll type it in the chat. They were interested in weird, like, occult stuff. And Also political stuff. They were the force behind the German Workers' Party. That was the leader of the Tula Society who kind of discovered Hitler. Before that, Hitler was sort of just like he had been in the military. He had tried and failed to get into art school, and now he was kind of almost like a political street pundit. And the leader of the society kind of identified him as a good orator. Yeah, actually, Stefan, now that's a good point. They did have a failed coup attempt, the Bierkellerputsch, right? The beer hall coup. And Hitler only spent 6 months in prison for this, right? It's insane. Like, what were they thinking? Oh, he probably won't do it again. In the meantime, he's in prison. You know what he's doing? He's writing Mein Kampf, My Struggle, where he says it all. He says the quiet part loud. Like, oh, we need to eliminate all the Jews in the final solution. It's all there in Mein Kampf. Like, oh my God. This is why you have to be on guard against authoritarianism. Julian, that's a great question. Well, see, the thing is, it showed, I think, that a lot of eugenics claims from earlier were wrong-headed. Like, we didn't understand how things were inherited before. We knew that traits were inherited, but we didn't quite know how, right? And the traits that we identified were probably not real genetic traits, right? Like, for example, one thing that the early eugenicists were trying to eliminate was wanderlust, right? Wanderlust. I want to go see the world, right? I want to go and travel. I want to meet people. I want to go see beautiful sunsets and eat different food. Wanderlust, right? Moral authorities at the time were like, oh, no, you can't do that. You have to stay here. You have to get married. You have to have a family. You can't go off and wander the globe by yourself. What are you, crazy? So, I mean, is there a wanderlust gene? No. Like, so some of these traits are silly, but there could, I mean, eugenics, if we started doing it again, could be so much more dangerous. Because, like, yeah, designer babies, there's a fine line there. I think designer babies, if you're doing something like in vitro fertilization, or if you're trying to screen for, like debilitating genetic conditions, then I think that might be okay. So I think treatment might be okay. But enhancement could be done with the same technology, right? And that's where you get into talk of like, oh, what if we genetically enhance, I don't know, people in the military or police officers, right? Which is not going to go the way that people want it to go. I'm sorry for this digression. I'm about to launch on my Captain America digression, but we have time. So everybody's familiar with Steve Rogers, Captain America, right? I just think this is a funny bit of pop culture that kind of ties in. I mean, come on, the Avengers, Captain America. Yeah, so Maxine, you'll know the origin story, right? It's back in the day. Steve Rogers wants to go and fight. He wants to be a soldier, but he's like short and skinny and whatever. And of course, it's World War II. The Americans are fighting the Nazis, right? And what do the Nazis want to do? Well, the Nazis, and Hydra, I suppose, because it's Marvel, the Nazis want to eliminate the inferior races. They're the master race. They're genetically superior. Basically eugenics. So what do the Americans do in Captain America Civil War? We've got to fight these evil Nazis. We better like genetically alter Steve Rogers over here and make a super soldier like the Nazis. Like, I always thought that was the silliest part of that movie. I like the movie. It's a good superhero movie. It's a good origin story. But this whole idea, like, we're going to fight science with science. these Nazis think they're the master race. Think they're superhuman. They're the Ubermensch. We better make our own Ubermensch, an American Ubermensch, right? Seems very strange to me. Yeah, if you can't beat them, join them. I'm like, yeah, isn't this the whole reason why you're fighting against the Nazis, or a big one? So that's my Captain America rant. But then, of course, like, yeah, I don't know. Superheroes are fun, but there are limits to what we can do with them allegorically, I suppose. But anyway, Captain America, decent guy. Good thing we genetically enhanced him rather than someone else. So, these views were actually very instrumental, or very influential. I'm talking ecology and social Darwinism. For example, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, he was a very strong supporter of ecology and the national park movement. Roosevelt is kind of presented as this outdoorsy man's man, right? Like the kind of guy that I would imagine would fight a bear with his bare hands or something, you know. He's a David Crockett sort of figure, which is interesting because he was actually kind of a sickly child. I think he struggled with asthma when he was young, but he grew up to be this, you know, strapping lad who loved to be in nature and stuff. And we probably in the United States wouldn't have such a nice national park system as they do, although that's come under threat, you know, in the years since. I think quite notably with Trump, who wanted to allow some oil drilling on some national parks or something. So Theodore Roosevelt was a bit of a nature boy, but he was also totally into the idea that the quote unquote Anglo-Saxon race, not a race, by the way, was the superior one. And he wanted, he advocated for the destruction of savage races. His you know, again, savage, not the preferred nomenclature. Okay, don't use that. I know none of you will, but you know, he's talking about, for example, the Spanish-American War, which of course the Americans won. That's the reason why you know, California, New Mexico, that's the reason why they're all states, is because the Spanish-American War was lost by the Spanish. And Roosevelt, this all happened prior to Roosevelt, but he saw the white Anglo-Saxon Americans as superior to these poor people. This is something that you see. I just want to bring this up briefly because this is something that you see in a lot of the very far right movements, who many of them are basically neo-Nazis, and they use this Aryan. They use Anglo-Saxon almost as a dog whistle for Aryan. So a dog whistle is like a term that you can say, but you mean a particular thing with it, and only certain people can hear that, namely other Nazis, right? So if I'm talking about you know, the Anglo-Saxon race, some Nazi would hear that as, oh, you mean the master race, right? That's what that means, right? You see, so that's kind of used as a dog whistle, and it also explains, you know, if you look back at racism in the United States throughout the 19th and 20th century, there was a lot of racism, not only on the part of white Americans against, you know, like Black Americans and Latin Americans, but against other Europeans. Why? Well, because of this idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. The British Empire, the empire on which the sun never sets, that was the idea. Nowadays, it might sound weird to entertain the idea that somebody who looks like me might have been racist against someone else who looks a lot like me. But back in the day, Anglo-Saxons were fighting with Irish and Italian people all the time. I mean, just watch like Gangs of New York or a movie like that. It gives you an idea. Yeah. Europeans used to be like so racist to one another. So if you ever meet one of these neo-Nazis and he's all about the white race, not a thing, but also just 50 to 100 years ago, this guy might have been the victim of racial discrimination on the part of another European. It's just crazy. I mean, just don't be racist, because it doesn't make any sense and it's a terrible thing to do. Just don't do it. Anyway, so that's Roosevelt. That's my Roosevelt rant, I suppose. And of course, this has come up before, but the Nazis also had very strong interests in ecology, right? They were all about getting out into nature, living close to nature. I mean, that's what their whole blood and soil thing was about. The blood was the people, and the soil was nature. And so this whole blood and soil thing, their interest in ecology and their racial extermination policies dictated their entire public health policy. So it's not contradictory for Hitler to have been a vegetarian, which he was, while people were being gassed to death in camps. Hitler was often pictured in nature with wild animals, almost to show like what a benevolent guy he must be. In the meantime, he's having people killed, right? And Germany, actually, this is really interesting. Germany led the world in efforts to tackle smoking. Germany was one of the earliest countries, Nazi Germany, that is, to treat smoking as a public health issue and to try and get rid of it. Probably a good move. But again, they are murdering people on an industrial scale at the same time. Like, it's crazy. A regular snow, right? Yeah, right. That's kind of, I mean, if you look at some of these pictures, yeah, like, you can't see me, but yeah, I picture that scene with all the birds landing on Snow White. Hitler's petting a baby deer, like, oh, look at the Fuhrer, he loves animals so much. Yeah, no. Boy, Nazi propaganda is far out. I mean, it really is. It really is when you go back and look at some of this stuff. But that's good to do, because then you can inoculate yourself against against propaganda. If you learn about propaganda and misinformation, it's kind of like getting a vaccine against it. So definitely, it's a good idea to do. Oh, the Dust Bowl. There's a different Roosevelt here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Duzick writes on page 184, with the Midwest Dust Bowl of the 1930s and the rise of FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression, holistic ecological thinking based on the climax community notion came to dominate the conservation movement. Mechanized agriculture in the form of the tractor was claimed to have caused the Dust Bowl. The sodbuster had bound himself by a different set of chains, those of technological determinism. Oh. The holistic and organismic approach to land management was contrasted with the partial, fragmented, and atomic approaches of individual interests, such as those of the farmer, real estate developer, or timber company. Not since the Romantic movement and the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century was there so great a conflict as that in 1930s between nature and society. Right here, I think, is when a lot of things came to a head. And I'm no historian, but I mean, we had the Dust Bowl in the 30s. The Depression hit before that in 29, I believe, the Great Depression. And up until this point, throughout the 19th century, but especially the later 19th century, nature was absolutely being like plundered by European settlers. Think here of the bison, the American bison, right? The American bison used to run the plains, roam the plains of the Americas in the millions. And when European people came here, they introduced diseases and disrupted the more localized native communities. You see, a lot of people have this idea that Native Americans or First Nations were think of the Plains Indians, right? Riding horses. People have this idea that that's how they always lived, but that's actually not the case. That's a post-European arrival thing. One reason is because they didn't have horses. The Spanish introduced horses to America. Horses had actually been extinct in America since the end of the Ice Age. So the Spanish got horses, they broke loose, and that's when Native Americans and First Nations kind of adopted the horse. Disease and European colonization also forced a lot of Native American communities out of a sort of towns and villages and cities that they lived in, and into a more pastoral lifestyle. And that's where we get the Plains Indians, right? Who would follow herds of bison and depended on them now as a source of food. With bison, you can make all kinds of things, not just food, right? You can make clothing, you can make weapons, you can make jewelry, you can use a bison for a lot of things. But then, of course, Europeans were over hunting the bison, and the bison nearly went extinct. And this, combined with economic and environmental things, I think a lot of things like this came to a head. Even the bald eagle, this is after, but the bald eagle almost went extinct because we were using DDT. And DDT makes the eggshells of the bald eagle eggs very fragile, so that the chicks will not survive. They won't hatch, and they'll die before they hatch. And so this is more like a 60s and 70s thing, but this is typical of the conservation movement, especially in America. Like, let's save the mighty bison, let's save the gorgeous bald eagle, and a lot of it came to a head and really fired off around this time. Probably wouldn't have saved the bald eagle or been interested in the effects of DDT if it weren't for this kind of this zeitgeist that was emerging, this conservation, sort of spirit of conservation that was emerging around this time. So let's see, did I read all of this? Not since the Romantic movement and the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century was there so great a conflict as that in the 1930s between nature and society. Yeah, I like that. Scientists would go on actually to question the notion of a climax community. Maybe it's not about harmonious equilibrium. Maybe there's a little disequilibrium going on here. A.G. Tansley, for example, he was a follower of Clements, the succession and climax community thinker, but he would go on to question this model. And as a result of the questioning of thinkers like this, some 20th century ecology actually emphasizes disequilibrium and process rather than succession and climax communities. So less linear, less teleological is how I read this: disequilibrium and process. There's no real actual harmony. It's the same way we treat function or purpose in evolution, if you like. Aristotle talks about function or purpose as in a telos, right? A telos, the final cause. It's what it's for. The fly is there to feed the frog, which is there to feed the bird or the fish or whatever. Or even think of the adaptations of particular animals. The frogs have these big long legs so they can leap and swim. Birds have wings so they can fly, right? Aristotle would say those are for that. But Darwinian evolution is not teleological. Darwinian evolution is just like, okay, we have a function, but that function is just there because it works. So the frog's legs are just there because frogs have evolved to live in water. So they need webbed toes and big long feet so they can jump into the water and swim. But the equilibrium could change due to some environmental catastrophe. And all of a sudden, frogs would not be adapted to it anymore. And they might have to go extinct or maybe evolve into something else, something that lives on land, maybe something like a toad, right? So what I'm saying is that we can talk about purpose in Aristotelian zoology or Darwinian evolutionary theory, but we mean different things. Same here. Succession and climax to me is more like progressive, whereas disequilibrium and process sounds a bit more like chaos, where patterns emerge, but it's not very linear, it's not very teleological, it's very chaotic. Maybe we can spell out some examples as we go. Duzic explains the emphasis on disequilibrium grew gradually as a Darwinian competition influence model of equilibrium was also developed out of the population science in a mathematical form. For instance, E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur's theory of island biogeography was formulated in conversations that began concerning the balance of nature that MacArthur formulated mathematically as a theory of equilibrium. So yeah, if you want to think of this as more mathy, and that's kind of what I was getting at with the chaos theory side of things, this is more mathy, whereas succession and climax is more like, almost like a historical way of looking at nature, if that makes sense. And I apologize, I'm a very bad mathematician, so I don't know if I could explain this very well, but okay, I got an example. If you, okay, equilibrium, that's completely comes out of chaos, order from chaos, mathematical order from chaos. I got it. Let's say you have 100 metronomes on a table, or 100 clocks with a pendulum hanging on the wall. They're all ticking away differently. But over time, something really interesting happens. Does anybody know what happens over time if you have clocks with pendulums? Yes, Zach, they sink. They sink because the pendulum swinging on all the clocks is sending vibrations through the machine into the wall, and that's affecting their motions such that eventually they will all synchronize. It's kind of spooky, but it's just physics. So this is order out of chaos. This is the disequilibrium where eventually we get equilibrium. This is the kind of thing that E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur are talking about, but in nature. So very different from the way we looked at it before. Okay, let's move on. Let's see, 1224. We're doing pretty good for time. He writes further that Tansley's terminology of ecosystem, rather than superorganism or community, was melded with Charles Eaton's notion of food chains and energy flows. The competition-based Darwinian economy of nature, with its version of the economic invisible hand leading to equilibrium and optimality, continued to have influence. However, the energy flow economic model emphasized rather economic notions of consumption and production, input and output. The new ecology also emphasized planning and management of the environment as a whole, just as the technocrats emphasized the planning and management of society. Now, there are some examples of this sort of planning and management on page 185, but I wonder if we can think of any of our own. Planning and management of the new ecology, inputs, outputs, consumption and production, and an economic model, or an energy flow economic model. I can think of one. So when I was young, I'll keep the chat open just in case someone has an example. But when I was young, I lived in the forest. Not in the forest, but yeah, I lived in the country. I lived in the countryside, and I would often go and explore nature. I found so many interesting critters, and I was like a little scientist. I would take them home, and I'd look them up in my books to identify them, and then I'd release them. And I still, I mean, oh God, look at my face. I still have such fond memories of doing that. And so I really liked the way nature worked, learning about it. As I got older, I got into fishing. I really like the water. I would fish, but just as often I would snorkel and look at little creatures under the water. Really cool. And that's when I started to learn about how the fish stocks in that area were managed, right? Sometimes the fish population in the lakes and rivers needed a boost. So the Ministry of Natural Resources would release lots of fish fry. Maybe they'd release some bass, some pickerel, whatever, right? But they would kind of manage the fish population this way so that anglers could go and fish and keep their catch, but we would not be impacting the ecosystem too severely. I remember when I was young, again, you can, oh man, you can tell I grew up in the country so hard right now. I remember when the spring bear hunt in Ontario was, they put a stop to that. And it was a noticeable difference. This happened when I was a kid, but they stopped the spring bear hunt and the bear population went up. It was noticeable. I saw a lot more bears after that. And just even nowadays, sometimes when I'm talking with my mom, who still lives out there, and she's also way into nature, they sometimes hunt. They sustainably hunt. My mom, and her partner will, for example, maybe take a moose, but that whole moose is going in the freezer. It's not for me though. I don't like moose. It's a little gamey. But they eat that. They eat all the fish they catch. They eat all the food they hunt. And they haven't been able to get a moose for a while because there just aren't enough tags. There's not enough in there to allow many hunters to hunt them. It wouldn't be sustainable. So hunting and fishing are, I think, a very much indicative of this sort of new ecology that emphasizes flow, inputs and outputs, and a sort of technocratic management and planning. I mean, after all, if you're a biologist, you can go and work for the Ministry of Natural Resources, and this will be your job. Your job will be to make sure there are enough fish and birds, and if there aren't, why, and what can we do about it, right? So that's my example. Anyone else have an example, or do you want to move on? I would just compare this really quickly to say how, say the First Nations manage their animal and fish stocks. They do get experts out there. Well, Western experts. I don't mean to say that they themselves are not experts. They are. But they're more like the holistic sort of approach. And maybe biologists are more of this new ecological approach. So, and they'll do a little bit of both. They'll get some scientists out there, but also maybe they're going to talk to the elders and say, what was the fishing and hunting like back in your day? What's changed? Because a lot of this, it's a really shame we didn't talk about non-Western technology and local knowledge. I bet this would have been in that chapter, but so maybe there's a sort of nowadays a sort of hybrid approach in First Nations communities where traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge come together to sort of manage the environment, but not in a super technocratic way. It's done in more of a holistic, traditional way. So that's kind of fun to think about. Well, let's move on then. So another quote, I'm sorry that these are so quote heavy. ecological science largely, though not entirely, underwent a shift in the 1930s and 1940s from a progress toward an ideal, climax community, and harmony of nature view via the notions of organism and equilibrium, to a disequilibrium view in which many possible end states are possible for an ecosystem. Oh God, Duzic, grammar. That's repetitive. See, this is what I mean when I say this is a weird book. View in which many possible end states are possible. I mean, call the redundant department of redundancy. That's no, don't write like that. Some thinkers, however, did sort of emphasize the idea of a superorganism. You know, really, I don't think I've emphasized this idea of an organism much. It really does come from Aristotle. An organized body is an organism. What is an organized body? An organized body has organs, little things that each have a different purpose, right? And Aristotle learned this from all his vivisecting. You know, maybe he's vivisecting a fish and he's looking at all the guts still while the fish is alive. He's maybe got a few minutes and he can see what's doing what. And this, by the way, is what Aristotle thought made something alive. It was an organized body that possessed certain parts of soul. A nutritive soul was most important. A nutritive soul was something that every living thing had, every organized body had. The nutritive soul is the organization and function of that body, which is what enables it to take in nutriment, so to eat, to grow, and to reproduce. So for Aristotle, the soul is not some Cartesian ghost in the machine or some Platonic spark of life that's going to go and live with the pure forms after you die and get reincarnated or something later. No. For Aristotle, the soul is the organized form of a living body. It's a form, but it's a lowercase f form, not a capital F form like Plato. So anyway, that's where we get this idea of organism from. And so William Morton Weaver still emphasized the idea of a superorganism. An ecosystem could be a superorganism. Does anyone know about any superorganisms that we could talk about now? I said think of a forest, which is probably a bit simplistic. There's a number of ways we could think of a superorganism, but let's have an example. Does anyone know of an example? I know of one, but I can't remember where it is. I'm going to look it up now. Oh, apparently Superorganism is also an English indie pop band. Cool. So there are lots of different examples that we could mention here. I'm thinking of something like a forest, which may be sharing one root system. And there are such forests where it turns out that every tree is genetically identical. Yeah, a bit like mangrove trees. I think in America, there's also a poplar forest, which is essentially like all one tree. It's all just one giant root system. So it looks like a forest with many trees, but it's really all one tree. Yeah, okay, yeah. I think maybe we're thinking of well, I thought the one I'm thinking of might be in North America, but there might be some, yeah. Wherever it is, yeah, there are massive forests like this where it looks like they're all individual trees, but they're actually all one big tree. Or fungus, right? I think the largest superorganism is actually a mycelial network that spans under a forest like this. A mycelial network is, you see, that's mushrooms. Mushrooms, the mushrooms that we see when we go outside and we see mushrooms growing in the grass or on trees, or if you're at the grocery store and you're buying delicious mushrooms, which you should, because mushrooms are a wonderful meat alternative. Yes, Julian. Yes, the nature of, I've seen that episode of The Nature of Things. That is a very good episode. I highly recommend it. I also Fantastic Fungi on Netflix is quite good. I've seen them both and I really enjoyed them. But fungi are very, very cool organisms. And mushrooms are also a pretty cool meat alternative. I'm not a vegetarian, but I try to like eat less meat than I used to. So every once in a while I'll do like a mushroom Monday or something and make a nice mushroom dish. So the mushrooms that we see are just fruiting bodies, but the mycelium are like the actual organism, a big network of cells that sometimes, you know, they can share nutrients amongst themselves and amongst other plants. They have symbiotic relationships with trees, for example, where they'll share things. The tree doesn't need these nutrients, so it'll exchange them with the fungus, and the fungus will give the trees something, right? Symbiosis. So that's a superorganism. But a superorganism can also be something as simple as like an ant colony. An ant colony is like a superorganism in that it's made up of lots of smaller organisms, which are very simple, but the behavior of the entire colony is quite complex, and the colony can get quite large. Just to continue here, during the 1920s, Alfred North Whitehead, British mathematician and logician turned Harvard metaphysician. I can't get over the way Duzic writes this sometimes. I'm sorry, but British mathematician and logician turned Harvard metaphysician. Is this like beat poetry? I don't know. Somebody could make a rap out of that. Anyway, he developed a philosophy of organism tied to relativity theory and early subatomic physics that held strong appeal to organismic biologists. Whitehead emphasized the priority of process over enduring substance and the priority of relations over simple qualities. Significantly, Whitehead also gave a defense of Romanticism against the mechanistic worldview of the 18th century Enlightenment in one of the most accessible and influential chapters of his Science of the Modern World. Yeah, bars. Duzic, like 1 minute Duzic is being redundant and not arguing anything, and another he's like spitting funky fresh rhymes. I don't know if I'm going to use this textbook again. I mean, it's been entertaining enough, but I don't know. So the philosophy of organism, you know, kind of similar to the main theme that we've been talking about before. Yeah, Tess, yeah, there's a number of typos. Heck, look at this. Look at this. I'll show. Oh, it's going to take me too long because my computer's slow. But yeah, even some of the chapter titles. Oh no. Oh no, now my computer. Okay, never mind, computer. Yeah, okay. Yeah, even some of the chapter headings are not spelled correctly. Yeah. It's almost there for me. I've seen actually, and I'm not trying to knock anybody here, but if you've ever read anything by Jesse Prince, brilliant philosopher. I don't know who he's getting to proofread his stuff though, because there's a lot of typos. But Duzic certainly comes close. But Duzic is not as. I don't find he gets me to engage as much as a thinker like Jesse Prince does. However, that could be because they are working in completely different areas, and I'm just more interested in mind and consciousness and stuff that Prince talks about than I am with this. But anyway, I don't think I'll use this book again. It's just, yeah, David Gunkel has a book that might be good. The problem is it's like 500 pages long, but you know what? I'll write my own book. One day, I'll write my own philosophy of technology book, and then I'll use it to teach the class. And it'll be great. Now, come on, computer, let's go. Okay, here we go. So now we get further into the future, or closer to the present, I should say, in the early 1970s. No, go back. 1970, incidentally, is... oh, come on, computer. Uh, I'll write my own philosophy technology book and I'll use the money to buy a new computer, darn it. That's what I'll do. Okay, in the 1970s, ecology went from a biological trend, or like a research trend in biology, to a full-on political movement, the Green Movement. Incidentally, 1970 was the first Earth Day, that we celebrated. So that's pretty cool. Duzek expands upon this a little bit. New Age holists, such as the ex-physicist Christoph Capra, appealed to ecology and the Green Movement to reinforce their holism. On the other hand, the fact that even the population biologist Paul Ehrlich should title his excellent popular summary of scientific population biology, The Machinery of Nature, shows how far most modern scientific ecologists are from the organismic or holistic opposition to mechanism as a philosophy. So yes, there has been an influence, but mechanism is still very much present. I'm okay with that. Carl Sagan, I think this phrase I know from Carl Sagan, who used it in his 1980 series Cosmos, but he added awesome to it. He would say the awesome machinery of nature, and he was talking about the universe, right? But this kind of environmentalism should sound, or this trend should sound more familiar to us. When I was growing up, we had Earth Day at school, and we learned about recycling. We even watched that old movie. It was an animated film, Fern Gully. Remember that? Robin Williams was a bat. It was a weird movie. It was like about a bunch of fairies that live in the rainforest, and they have to, it's a children's movie, but they have to stop the loggers from cutting down the forest. It's a little heavy-handed, but maybe that's why I remember it after all these years. A much better animated movie about humans, technology, nature, the environment, which you can enjoy as an adult? Can anyone guess what I'm about to say? Oh, that's a good, actually, that's not what I was going to say. Oh my God, well, these are actually all, yeah, Avatar ripped off Fern Gully. Avatar, I see what you mean. Yeah, basically, Avatar is Fern Gully in space, but it's also kind of Dances with Wolves in space. So, I don't know that Avatar really rips these things off. I think it just uses a lot of overused tropes. But yeah, Avatar is an interesting example. Lorax is good. Watership Down is good. I would say all of you are correct about this. I was thinking of Princess Mononoke. I don't know if any of you have seen that or heard of it, but you should. Yeah, that's the most forgettable $2 billion movie. Yeah. It was okay. I thought the effects were cool. I thought the story was unimaginative. The effects were cool. The story was cookie cutter, kind of like white savior kind of thing. The story didn't do it for me. I mean, if we're talking James Cameron movies, his later stuff is all about the effects, right? It started with Titanic, fairly blasé story, great effects for the time, but, story, Terminator had a good story. Terminator 2 had a good story, just saying. No, the movie I'm talking about is called Princess Mononoke, and it is an anime film by Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. And it really deals with this sort of human versus nature, technology and nature thing, very holistic. It would be if you are stuck on an essay and you don't know what to write about. Maybe you've submitted your proposal, but you are uninspired and unable to write a paper on one of these movies: Mononoke, Watership Down. Yeah, Jonah. Okay, so have you seen the film I'm talking about? Yeah. It's very gray, not color wise, but it's not like nature good, humans bad. And it's also very honest. There aren't really any clear-cut heroes or villains, just people doing what they believe is the right thing to do. Anyway, for the rest of you, don't be scared of animation. Don't be scared of movies in other languages. I mean, that's not to say you are. Anime is bigger than ever now. When I was an undergraduate, yeah, the dub is decent. The dub is decent. They've got some good voice actors. And the animation is gorgeous. But yeah, back when I was in high school, anime was very nerdy, and you would get made fun of if you admitted you watched it. You would have to have a group of people that you could talk to. Now it's blown up so much. Everyone's watching anime now. It's so popular. So that's really cool. I don't know this one. Koyaanisqatsi? What is that a film? Ah, I don't know it, but I'll have to check it out. What I was going to say is, yeah, like if you find you're stuck or you want to change of topic, write about one of these films and technology and nature. Get your imagination going, why not? Are we more holistic or more mechanistic now? I still think that we are. I mean, speaking personally, I feel like I'm a little bit of both. And I think that our approaches to conservation and stewardship are probably a bit of both. I think that we're in a unique position in Canada because, granted, we certainly have not always done this, but I think that we are taking seriously now a lot of the non-Western knowledge that our First Nations communities have when it comes to protecting the environment. And I think we need to elevate those voices. I really think we do. Because they have, because in those cultures, there's a tradition of the importance of nature. Whereas we Westerners, we white folks are standing apart from nature, and it's this other thing, right? And we're standing apart from it, and we can do what we want, which no, we can't. It's like in the book of Genesis, God creates everything for man, so we can do what we want with it. But no, we can't. I think that First Nations communities, Aboriginal communities from around the world, and also a lot of Eastern religion and philosophy, of course, is much more holistic, and we really need to do that. We need to get back to that, and we also need to use our knowledge, our scientific knowledge. We need the best of both worlds, is what I'm saying. Let's see here. About this from Wikipedia. The film is the first in the Katsi film trilogy, succeeded by Powakatsi and Nakoikatsi. The trilogy depicts different aspects of the relationship between humans, nature, and technology. Koyaanisqatsi is the best known of the trilogy and considered a cult film. Wow, that's really interesting. I'll have to check it out. I will actually. Once class is wrapped up, that sounds interesting. I'll watch the whole trilogy even. Thank you. Thank you for the tip. Everyone else, I encourage you to check out. If some of these films are coming up that you haven't heard of, check them out. Relax. You're all going to want to relax pretty soon, I imagine, now that we're almost done classes. So now we've got lots of things that we can use to relax. Lots of movie ideas. Real quick, deep ecology. We've got like 5 minutes. So deep ecology is a movement that emphasizes nature's intrinsic value. Juzik explains that deep ecology is a movement whose name and principles were first formulated by Norwegian philosopher Arne Naess. Deep ecology claims that the usual approaches in scientific ecology and the environmentalist movement are shallow, in that they treat nature as an object of human use for human benefit. Deep ecology claims that we have to go further and treat nature as having value in itself, apart from any human use. Absolutely, 100%. I think we can all get on board with that. I certainly can. So this view rejects anthropocentrism in Spinoza and deep ecology. First of all, who was Spinoza? Anybody know? Yes, God equals nature. Double exclamation mark. Correct. Spinoza's famous dictum was God or nature. Same thing. Spinoza was a philosopher, but he was also a pantheist, which got him into a bit of trouble. Got him excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, in fact, because he was saying that God is just nature. And that's what pantheism means. Pan, all, theism, belief in God. So belief in God as everything. God is the universe, if you like. So there's only one substance, and that's God. And there are different attributes that the substance can have. Infinite attributes, really, because it's God. But there's two that we know about, like thought and extension. And we are all finite modifications of these sorts of attributes and modes, right? So if nature is God, or God is nature, well, and we're a part of it, we're not separate from it. We're all in nature. That's deep ecology. If I've ever heard about deep ecology, that's it. And some later deep ecologists were also influenced by Heidegger, which I think probably has something to do with his outlook on technology. But unfortunately, in some of his other work, he is on, there's a lot of that blood and soil kind of rhetoric in his work. Heidegger hated city life. He was an outdoorsy, go hiking, put on your lederhosen and head up to Tottenauberg and go hiking or something. He was into peasant life. He thought that with life in the city, there's more technology, and it's inevitable that technology will sort of diminish your Dasein, right? Your being in the world. He could be the best being by being in nature, Heidegger would say. Okay, I think we're almost finished here. What about the political side of things? Oh my God, a typo. What about the politics side of things? Well, Duzic says, for deep ecologists, and to a lesser degree, many other radical political ecologists, the approach of mainstream scientific and government agency ecology is too close to the very technological domination of nature that deep ecologists oppose. The terminology of managing ecosystems that many mainstream environmental scientists and agencies use implies this sort of control. Deep ecologists claim that such system management itself is part of the disease, not the cure. Despite this, Noss himself falls into technocratic language in his presentation of deep ecology. Maybe there's no way around that, because even though we are part of the system, we have to talk about it in a way that gives us some kind of agency within the system, because we have agency, whether for good or bad. We've been buggering up the environment for a while now. So that's one sense in which we have agency, but also we have the power to make changes to what we're doing. We have the power to conserve forests and ecosystems, to stop polluting the ocean, to mitigate climate change. We can do these things. And I think we need that technocratic language. We need to remember that we are part of a holistic system, but that technocratic language kind of gives us agency, or it makes clear our agency. So maybe we're not really managing. We're just a part of the system doing something that will affect the rest of the system. We're not managing. We're tuning one of the clocks on the wall to try to synchronize everything, right? But that's my take on it anyway. I don't know. Maybe some of you have different thoughts, but I hope that this lecture has given you some food for thought. So next time is our last lecture, next Tuesday, last lecture of the term. Holy moly, I can't believe we've made it, everyone. So we're only going to discuss, as I said earlier, ecofeminism, and I'll skip the remaining sections of this chapter. I'm doing this because ecofeminism has to do with, obviously, ecology, which is the subject of today's chapter, but we'll also be able to connect it back to some of the themes from women, feminism, and technology as well. And then if time permits, we're just going to have a little discussion for the rest of the class to reflect on what we've learned this semester. All right. So thank you very much for dropping by, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Cheers. End transmission.